Thank you for coming to the seminar speaker series today. I am standing in for Peter Monge, and am happy to do so to introduce Professor Karen Tongson from the English department here at USC. She's also affiliated faculty in American Studies and Ethnicity and in Gender Studies. Her topic today, Inland Emperors, Sexuality at the End of the Suburbs, is part of her forthcoming book, which is called Relocations, Queer Suburban Imaginaries, and it's coming out soon from NYU Press.
End of 2010.
End of 2010, which is very soon. And in the book and in the, I think the talk today, she's going to be exploring some of the histories and the intersections between different histories of empire and queer sexuality in Southern California's Inland Empire. And so for those of you who are new to Southern California and you haven't been to the Inland Empire, it is a must-see.
Absolutely.
All parts of it are must-see, so you must go. She's also, Professor Tongson is also working on a new project where she's exploring Filipino musicians who travel on the leisure circuit in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how Karen defines the leisure circuit, but that work is still to come. So, so we have time for questions afterwards. Please welcome Professor Karen Tongson.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here, having lunch, and hearing this work from my book. I'd like to thank Peter Monge for inviting me, Sarah Weiser for introducing me, Nina O'Brien for all of her help with putting together this event today. And so the talk, as Sarah explained, that I'm presenting is from my forthcoming book, Relocations. What you're going to hear today is a mix of, it's sort of, think about it as a preview reading of this book. Some portions of it will be read from the text. Part of it because I want to share with you how the writing of this book is actually part of the kind of theoretical praxis, I think, that happens throughout this text. So I'll be kind of weaving back and forth between some of this writing and, when necessary, some truncation. This is pulled a very brief excerpt of a 90-page chapter. So trying to cram a lot of material in to share with you today about the Inland Empire, which is endlessly fascinating to me. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the book first, Relocations. Relocations flows from beginning to end through the freeway tributaries that tenuously bind the sprawling counties of Southern California's suburban landscape, from Orange County to the Inland Empire to the inner suburbs of East and Southeast LA. We enter these counties that glow at night like neat sherbet grids from the twisted surfaces of concrete clover leaves, the elaborate off-ramps that spiral towards home past earnestly edged lawns, big box shops, and tawdry strip malls looking wan beneath layers of worn stucco, yet teeming with more than commerce. Contained in these boxes, little and large, are the unacknowledged urgencies, desires, and encounters amongst the very communities meant to be kept out of these meticulously planned geographies. Queers, immigrants, gangsters, minimum wagers, others who find the notion of a nuclear family as toxic as it sounds. And so two of the major interventions in Relocations kind of merge and weave together. The first being that the book, of course, tackles the kind of common national and popular mythos about the suburbs' homogeneity, right? White picket fences, white people, right? And in addition to addressing that, the other intervention comes in through the realm of queer studies, which is very cosmopolitan-oriented, which is very much about the kind of vibrant subcultures of the cities. And so I envision the intervention of the book kind of creating a crossing over between those two arguments. And the kind of theoretical form and shape that takes is really one that's pulled from the landscape, and it's called the Cloverleaf that I just opened with, that image of the Cloverleaf interchanges. And part of my hope today in sharing basically that cloverleafing method is that we can have more time at the end of the talk to talk about methodology, how one might write sexuality in the suburbs. And one of the things that I'm also focusing on is how, you know, the suburbs in particular in Southern California are really a kind of topographical nexus for studies of American imperialism crossing over with other forms of imperialism. So the Cloverleaf, I'm going to begin with, is the shape and form for something like what I would call an affective historiography. Okay. And so the book itself, and this chapter, you'll see two different parts of it, mimics the perilous Cloverleaf freeway interchanges that I opened with. Once created to keep the flow of traffic moving on and off the major arteries of transit and from cities to suburbs, Cloverleafs now, as many other architectures created with convenience in mind, have become the source of what they sought to prevent: congestion, confusion, aggravation. So Cloverleaf interchanges require an elaborate choreography between vehicles and drivers. Rather than merging directly onto the flow of traffic with the aid of lights and signals, the Cloverleaf offers an interstitial lane upon which vehicles traveling at different speeds and at cross purposes, some are exiting, others are entering, negotiate their transactions of motion within a death-defying instant. During my earliest experiences on Southern California's freeways as a novice and newly licensed 16-year-old driver, Cloverleafs terrified me the most. Careening onto a single lane to exit the freeway at high speeds, or trying desperately to merge while keeping control of a car hurtling with the centrifugal force of a twisting on-ramp, challenged my ability to see beyond the blind spots these structures aggravated. But once I learned how to use them, to see the other cars, time the traffic, and adjust my speed according to another's flow, I took a pleasure and thrill in the dangerous transaction, the elaborate dance between drivers destined for different destinations, yet forced by design to notice one another as if their lives depended on it. For that instant, they do. The suburban and the urban, queer narratives and normative ones, history and theory, may be at cross purposes and propelled by different philosophies toward different destinations. But I force them to interact in relocations as if they were on one of these Cloverleafs. They meet transiently, aware they're inhabiting one another's blind spots, and yet are willing to yield their right of way to take the risk of crossing in time and space together, lest there be a fatal and catastrophic collision. So now I'm going to take you on one of these Cloverleafs to the Inland Empire, where you'll see we'll begin with a history crossing over and merging with some deep queer temporal theory. Okay, so section one is, I'll let you read these epigraphs, and the first section I'm going to talk about is called Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. Before the mid-1950s and the televisual emergence of Disneyland in Orange County, there existed another orange empire crafted by gentlemen farmers from the East and cultivated by immigrant laborers from Mexico and the Far East. It all began in a place they once compared to the Garden of Eden, Riverside, California. In his expansive history of the Orange Empire, Douglas Kazoo-Sackman explains how the orange, which most likely originated in the Malay East Indian archipelago some 20 million years ago, passed to the hands of indigenous peoples, colonial explorers, and missionaries until the 1820s, when a mutation in a grove in São Salvador de Bahia, Brazil, created a new and succulent variety of orange, a seedless specimen fusing a smaller, embryonic orange within the body of a larger one. That's the navel. Eventually, an American woman named Mrs. Nellie Desmond from Syracuse, New York, brought several of these navel oranges home as souvenirs after visiting her brother at a rubber camp along the Amazon. Hearing of Mrs. Desmond's curious find, the U.S. Commissioner of Agriculture procured several of the seedless tiny tree grafts for the Agricultural Department in Washington, D.C., where a woman in search of better air, not better hair, but maybe, and better health, named Elizabeth Tibbetts, was on her way to Riverside, California to join her husband Luther. And this was about the 1870s. So she was given several of these grafted budstocks before her westward relocation, and it blossomed into the parent navel orange tree, a feat of agricultural ingenuity that in 1902 was transplanted from the Tibbetts yard to the corner of Arlington and Magnolia Avenues, where it remains standing today. So this is shortly after it was transferred from the yard to that corner. And this is what it looks like now. That's it. Behind the corner there. I'll explain this. Surrounded by wrought iron gates, the parent navel orange tree sits forlornly across the street from a strip mall anchored by a 7-Eleven and a nail salon. The tree is almost indistinguishable from the other water-starved shrubs that share its side of the sidewalk. Though you can still see some citrus ranches when you drive down Dufferin Street or Victoria Avenue, and while many of Riverside's residents still have orange trees in their yards, like the Tibbetses of yore, the title orange belongs to others now. The exact moment of the region's transition from an orange to inland empire has never been clarified, although local historians have traced the moniker Inland Empire all the way back to citrus's heyday at the beginning of the 20th century. So in 1914, the Riverside Press Enterprise, the local paper, published a progress edition, and that was the first time in that glossy insert that something called the Inland Empire was referred to. And it was in part a kind of real estate ploy, but it was also to promote the region for development. The boundaries of the Inland Empire have been frequently redrawn since that first glossy insert announced a land of progress, eventually incorporating, depending on who you ask, all of Riverside and San Bernardino counties, certain outlying desert communities like Victorville and Barstow, and even the liberal arts college towns further west like Claremont, Pomona, and Laverne, a few of which technically belong to LA County. Though the empire's boundaries are nebulous, its sense of being inland, not just geographically, but pejoratively in the parlance of contemporary California real estate, was intensified with the mid-20th century emergence of its coastal cousin to the west, Orange County. And my chapter leading into this one is written about Orange County and the theme parks there, and the kind of 80s nightclubs that were open that queer youth attended at the time. The Inland Empire, left with little but show citrus, closed steel plants, and decommissioned defense factories, is further from Orange County than its contiguity on the map might suggest. And yet, it's closer to worlds even further afield than its sturdy, implacable rows of 60s tract homes belie. So the sentiment that Summer Roberts expressed on the OC when she heard about the Inland Empire town of Chino, she just responds, ew, is a sentiment that's been shared by many residents in Southern California since other towns blossomed and surpassed this aspiring empire from the 50s onward. No one, it seemed, ever really wanted to be in the Inland Empire, and yet somehow everyone from everywhere relocated there, which is the nature of that epigraph from Susan Straightforth that I shared with you. So in light of all this, it seems fitting that a seedless, mutant navel, incapable of reproducing on its own, gave rise to Riverside, San Bernardino, and the other towns enveloped in the larger husk of the region known as the Inland Empire. A place cultivated by a dream of empire that withered on its diminishing vines throughout the 20th century and on into this one. Once adored by the 19th century patrician travel writer Kate Sanborn as a place where you'll see enough flowers to overwhelm a Broadway florist, the region is now, in the words of Percival Everett, quote, known for meth labs and prisons and brutal summers and the occasional cougar wandering through town. Once heralded as a haven of affordable housing for dreamers of the golden dream, to invoke Joan Didion's words, it is now ground zero for the nation's mortgage crisis, a postcard for the recession, according to the Los Angeles Times. Surveying its stubborn monuments today, like the parent navel orange tree on Magnolia Avenue, affirms that the Inland Empire was never just a homogeneous conglomeration of little boxes, but truly the crossroads of empire. And I'm going to explain how, and aside from the kind of vestiges of the Spanish colonial imaginaries that are there in the Inland Empire, that actually the word empire is very resonant with the kind of residual discourse of empire from 19th century Britain. And so, but one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out from the beginning, and this courtesy of Mike Davis, is that the Inland Empire itself was the kind of cadastral point from which all the glamorous movie land boulevards and drives, Wilshire, Rodeo, Sunset, and so on were originally derived. So the kind of project of mapping Southern California really began there in San Bernardino County in the San Bernardino Mountains. And I won't read the quote for you, but you can kind of look at it there and get a sense of how Mount San Bernardino, all roads, the roads of empire in Southern California were created from Mount San Bernardino. As the 20th century marched on and through numerous phases of development, boom, and bust, the Inland Empire has inevitably receded into the background, a bass, or like a bass, laying down the rhythm to an elaborate song felt in time, but barely heard. And yet the Inland Empire's failures, its failure to hold the line, failure to make profit, failure to take seed, have also been the source of its profoundest successes. Failure, in other words, is its contribution to a larger spatial imaginary about what Southern California might ultimately come to mean in this millennium. But what has truly failed in the Inland Empire is the destiny of empire itself. Earlier this year, Time magazine offered the region a grim diagnosis as it presaged the death of the American suburbs altogether. Quote, not every suburb will make it. The fringes of a suburb like Riverside in Southern California, where housing prices have fallen more than 20% since the bust began, could be too diffuse to thrive in the future where density is no longer taboo. Because this place, as the queer theorist Lee Edelman might say, has no future, dare we leap to the conclusion that there's something about the Inland Empire that is discursively, representationally, structurally queer? Or is there some other way to read and inhabit what is queer in and about the Inland Empire? So I grapple with those questions in the longer chapter, but before I kind of turn then to the kind of British histories of empire in the area, I want to make a bit of a disclosure. It behooves me to admit that these stories, these grids, this place, are not just another archive upon which to exercise my years of training in the dark scholarly arts of queer literary and cultural studies. Though all of the materials and regions in Relocations genuinely mean something to me, the Inland Empire is my cardinal coordinate, the Erline for this entire project. Like other dreamers of the Golden Dream who found themselves in the IE, a new people, my musician parents and I landed there after many migrations and relocations to and from other imperial landscapes and soundscapes. In graduate school, I was trained as a Victorianist. And I learned about the elaborate cultural and bureaucratic machinations of the British Empire. Schooled in the discourses and materialities of empire, I sought its traces in other environments and came to understand how it functioned correlatively in my other home context, the Philippines I left as a child. A place, in the words of Jessica Hagedorn, that spent, quote, 400 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. Quote. It took some time for me to realize, however, that in studiously seeking stories and evidence of empire elsewhere, I failed to notice I spent my entire adolescence surrounded by its sounds and structures in the inland region of Southern California, a place I thought only played for profit with empire's name. The Inland Empire amused itself with British imperial echoes, or so I thought, but played for keeps with America's commercial and military might. Riverside, the town that reared me, has a long history of collective fascination with all things British, and its persevering attachment to Victoriana might explain a few things about my own twisted career path from a venerable Victorianist to whatever I am now, but that's another story. So actually every year the town hosts this elaborate Dickens festival. If you've ever driven around Riverside, you'll see that some of its kind of points of interest are modeled after Victorian homes. There's a citrus heritage house. And all of the kind of Victorian architectures of the place really coincide with what Riverside also tries to promote. The Chamber of Commerce definitely tries to promote as its early 20th century citrus heritage. So the town thoroughfare that symbolizes this legacy is the lengthy palm-lined Victoria Avenue. And these are a couple of citrus labels that kind of play upon that imaginary, right? And this, the palm-lined Victoria Avenue is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Victoria Avenue continues to be lovingly preserved by town boosters and preservationists as a specimen of the grand highway concept of Victorian landscape design. Large sections of Victoria Avenue are still lined by citrus groves. Riverside's oldest high school, Polytechnic or Poly High, holds a Victoria Avenue address. And the parkway ambles past the elite Victoria Club near the Arroyo, a private country club founded in 1903, only a couple of years after its namesake, the Empress of India, Queen Victoria of Great Britain, and Ireland passed into history. After crossing the ornate Victoria Bridge, straddling the parched Arroyo Riverbed, Victoria Avenue narrows into a regular two-lane road without any botanical dissection, remaining oddly quaint in a Southern California infrastructure prone to stretching out into 4- and 8-lane avenues to accommodate Hummers and SUVs, Empire's latest vessels of war turned recreational status symbol. Scaled to more modest proportions, Victoria winds through East Riverside, a neighborhood populated in the mid-20th century by middle-class African-American families. And in the interim, the area has also become a housing destination for working-class Latino families. Carnicerias, a few neighborhood bodegas, all of these anchor some of the street corners en route to Victoria's endpoint on University Avenue at a place called the Thunderbird Lodge, an Indian-themed motel that was a dilapidated specimen of mid-century roadside architecture until its more recent innovation in the corporate Best Western idiom. Although Victoria Avenue, at its culmination, offers a glimpse at many vestiges of the American empire, it also remains one of Riverside's roads that leads directly back to the British Empire. And so the story of Victoria Avenue, and actually the story of the citrus growth of Riverside, began with an Irish jeweler raised in Canada named Matthew Gage. And in the 1880s and 90s, he developed a canal through Riverside and through large parcels of land in that area that would harness the waters of the Santa Ana and irrigate the kind of citrus lands of that area. And so the citrus growth and boom in that period was very much attributed to him. And the thing with Gage is that he couldn't afford to build these canals on his own. He couldn't galvanize enough capital in the U.S. to get these things built. So what he ultimately had to do was to enlist the help of a kind of Orientalist collector of Oriental art from England named William Crudeson. And Crudeson happened to have connections in the Price Waterhouse Company in the UK. And so eventually the money that built the canal, that built the Inland Empire, came directly from Victoria's empire. It came from the Riverside Trust Company Limited, which coalesced in 1889 to help fund the building of the region. So, and so we come to learn that there's actually something more behind the region's Victorianism than a fondness for Charles Dickens and period landscaping. English capital is what helped make Riverside the capital of the Orange Empire in Southern California at the end of the 19th century. And to invoke the British Riverside Trust Company's motto, the budding Orange Empire was fueled by, quote, American energy and English capital. Okay, so we have actually not just a kind of play with empire, but the kind of literal tributaries that lead to the UK. Though Riverside, like so much of Alta California, was first wrenched from indigenous peoples during the Spanish missionary era in the 18th century and converted into Mexican ranchos in the early to mid-19th century, it materialized at the fin de siècle as a Western American outpost of a British empire on the cusp of waning. Residents of Citrus-era Riverside fancied themselves part of their own English colony. There are actually extended histories of the region written about how they tried to recreate and name themselves an English colony during the 1890s and the teens in the 19th century. So they celebrated Queen Victoria's birthday every year in the Inland Empire. But on her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the gentlemen orchardists and denizens of this English colony threw a much more elaborate celebration at the town's Loring Opera House, where 3 becoming portraits of, quote, Her Majesty and Union Jack stood on the stage covered in flowers. Alongside Victoria's likenesses that evening were several portraits of the U.S. President, William McKinley, draped in American flags as well. So on that stage that opened only 7 years prior with a production of Gilbert and Sullivan's Yolanthe, spectators of Queen Victoria's Jubilee in Riverside's Opera House also bore witness that night to empires crossing over. In 1898, within a year of this Riverside fete for the British Queen, McKinley's modern American empire would begin to take shape in the Caribbean and the Pacific after the U.S. acquired partial control of Cuba, annexed Hawaii, and took ownership of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So much as Spanish missionary culture was replaced by British capital in this parcel of Southern California, Spain was also dispossessed of the territories McKinley coveted in the Pacific and the Caribbean for his own civilizing mission. And in addition to the kind of story that gets told from here on out about the kind of imperial crossing over that seemed to happen through these incidental histories is that in addition to the kind of British and American capital coming together in Riverside, there was, of course, the laborers from Japan, the Philippines, and Korea who were also coming to help build and cultivate the orchards and the railroads in the region. And this inspired some of the town's architectural flourishes that veer towards Orientalism. In particular, they had one celebration actually for Matthew Gage, the canal builder, where they festooned the lobby in Chinese lanterns in honor of the Chinese inhabitants of the period of the area at the time. And they also invited the Emperor Matsuhito of Japan to celebrate his birthday in Riverside. And so many kind of imperial birthdays celebrated there, and his particular birthday celebration ended with a spirited cry, "Banzai, banzai," along with the emperor. So, and even today, you'll see this is a Chinese pagoda or Chinese pavilion that's in front of the Riverside Public Library. So, which is a mid-century building that otherwise has clean and bureaucratic lines. The Inland Empire's shift from Occident to Orient, then, is not so much sequential, tracking its way to and through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, as it is simultaneous with the British imperial imaginary. Indeed, these imperial imaginaries that have always been entangled with one another among the citrus groves, on the railroads, and in the British and American versions of Orientalism in the area's development from its incipience to the present. The filmmaker William E. Jones is right to say that there is no empire in the Inland Empire. Instead, there have been all too many. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a sense there that the area is really redolent with these imperial imaginaries happening. And so what happens to Gage as he cultivates, he builds this Orange Empire? That's part of why they call it the Orange Empire. The kind of sad thing at the end of that particular story is that Gage himself went into bankruptcy and his home was lost to foreclosure. So as the local historian Tom Patterson explains in Brutal Expository, the longtime Gage home on a 10-acre lot on 14th Street was lost to foreclosure. This is a line that resounds today, echoed daily in newsprint or glowing from computer screens as newspapers themselves cease to clutter doorways and driveways. Only the names and addresses have been changed. Incidental histories of failure and foreclosure are actually what began to take seed in this era, even during the region's first flush of imperial fantasy. All of this has happened before, and it will happen again, to echo the nihilism of the hit sci-fi reboot, Battlestar Galactica. The suburbs have always been about a here, now, and future, with a tenuous relationship to past that never were, or only as we might want them. Quaint, sepia-tone narratives of success, development, and the triumph of successive generations. And yet the stubborn traces of empire call forth something else, maybe a curse more than a blessing of what success actually brings and at what costs. It sometimes leads askew, as imperial narratives are prone, back to the space of distraction, to an otherwise and elsewhere that both unearths and recovers what it might ultimately mean. Norman Klein writes that forgetting is a twin. Its tandem effect is best called simultaneous distraction. It's the instant when one memory defoliates another. So after this genealogy of the emperors and empires who passed through the region, loaned their names to its streets, or simply never were, we've arrived at another instance of memorial distraction in the wake of devastation. So what memories would allow us to defoliate this one in order to get us to a queer here, now, and then? We peel back the layers and gaze at that unremarkable, smaller part of the navel, encased by fleshier, more substantial fruit. I'll open with these epigraphs and you guys absorb them. So one other thing that Gage was credited with was giving the region a new social accent. That was kind of a quote from a local historian named Thomas Patterson. And though we might think that that accent that would resemble a Commonwealth accent, and it's morphed over that period of time, a kind of Commonwealth British accent, there's a way in which we kind of think of that as a gesture of the past. But is it really so strange that nearly 100 years after Gage launched his efforts to build an empire, that I heard this British accent again? In 1983, when I landed in Riverside with my musician parents, a British accent whistling through Victoria Avenue's palms, down a vanished Chinatown's Wong Way, slicing diagonally past the graveyard in a sandwich shop called Butch's Grinders, sinking deep into my adolescent bones after being remixed and refracted through time on the radio and MTV. The slinky, synthy sounds of British pop, an imperial new wave from the much heralded second British invasion sold to SoCal Kids by a local video and disc jockey named Richard Blade, formerly Richard Shepherd of Torquay, England. Richard changed his last name to Blade when he moved to LA in '82 as an homage to the neo-noir of the film Blade Runner. On his local broadcast shows like Video One and Video Beat on KHJ and KTLA respectively, and as the marquee DJ on K-Rock, the rock of the 80s, Blade curated the soundtrack for my re-entry into the so-called First World in the Philippines. So my extended radio and TV dates with bands like Scritti Politti, Spandau Ballet, Blancmange, ABC, Depeche Mode, and Duran Duran introduced me to a modern English with continental flourishes that activated new forms of remote intimacy in the Inland Empire, a place that resembled everywhere and nothing to me. Of course, I wasn't the only one in the IE, or Southern California for that matter, captivated by these British accents in pop in the early 80s. Music scholar Michel Habel-Palan emphasizes the effect of K-Rock's dissemination of British New Wave and ska in the Southern California region. And one of the authors that I write about in this book, Alex Espinosa, whose bulk of my reading of his novel is in the Inland Empire chapter, was the gestures of writing for him were inaugurated by listening to that British pop of the 80s at the time. So I mentioned these incidents not simply to dwell in memory as it makes itself heard or felt in certain geographies, but to beg the question of what we might make of certain displaced gestures of belonging in Southern California's suburb. What is the analytic engendered by these sonic gestures to a place, the UK in this sense, that many of us immigrant kids never visited, but only heard of or heard in the slightly accented inflections of a singer or DJ's voice? I imagine that we were, in our own way, practicing what the queer theorist Jennifer Terry and I have collaborated to call remote intimacy. And it's a key phrase that I invoke throughout my book. Terry has used it to describe some of the circuits of affect generated by surveillance technologies. And she talks about the kind of remote intimacies that were configured, especially during the War on Terror, and the kind of surveillance technologies that were installed at that time. But I've kind of transcribed this, and she's given me the license to run with it, to think of remote intimacy as a way in which different communities find their intimacies cohering through virtual networks of desire, like radio, music, and television, on the internet, and through online social networking sites. Remote intimacies account both technically and affectively for the symbiosis that can happen between disparate subjects, like the storied connection between Latinos and Morrissey, for example, or between suburban kids of color and Anglophilic ear candy in general. Like most adolescent females of the early 80s, I became smitten with the British band Duran Duran and created elaborate fantasies about Birmingham, England, their place of origin. Nothing seemed more exotic to me than a place name with ham in it. So regal, so old world, so Atlantic. In my own holding pattern of relocations around the Pacific Rim, my Laban-addled mind failed to process the fact that the locales in Duran Duran's music videos, especially for the jet-setting Rio album, had little to do with the Birmingham of my pubescent fantasies. Instead, their videos recaptured the colonial imaginaries of a bygone British Empire, restyled by Vivienne Westwood, some new romantic looking for the TV sound on a redrawn planet Earth. So much as Michelle Habel-Palan confesses to not being able to draw some of the connections between the politics of her affection for British pop during that era, I too didn't quite grasp that Birmingham, in all of its gritty industrial glory, might have actually been closer to the Inland Empire than I dared imagine. Orange County's beaches were only a 45-minute drive away, but my immigrant fancy preferred to wander worlds away to seaside destinations I never visited, yet felt more familiar. Places that once belonged to other empires, like Belize, where Wham's Club Tropicana video was shot, or Antigua, Duran Duran's alluring azure and white sand backdrop for the Rio video. The Spanish broke the colonial seal in both Belize and Antigua, and the Brits followed up gamely, just like in the Inland Empire. And in the Inland Empire, as they did in the Philippines, the United States came and asserted its own imperial aspirations onto the landscape, erecting military bases and laying the foundation for the industries of warcraft to fuel its booms after oranges were not enough. But this incidental British imperial history of Riverside and the Inland Empire that compelled the intellectual labor in the earlier part of this talk first revealed itself to me, perhaps could only be revealed to me, in the sonic residue of British pop as an echo of another subject, to invoke Philippe Lacoulabat. In the echo of the subject, Lacoulabat theorizes how being haunted by a melody, as Freud's pupil Theodore Reich was, undergirds the narratival compulsion to confess. The confession elicited by these echoes of and from elsewhere, for me, is one that admits a disturbing intimacy between queer provincial longings and the cosmopolitan spaces, objects, and temporalities that inform queer spatial imaginaries. One such confession, as I wind towards my conclusion, appears in Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's 1992 preface to Between Men, where the author narrates her own belated textual experience of remote intimacy through her provincialism, which was oriented towards other queer metropolitan destinies. These destinies were awakened in part by British and continental literary texts of male homosocial desire. Whereas Sedgwick's enactment of a remote intimacy to times, places, and scenes beyond her provincial purview gets routed in Between Men through the sign of the literary. The remote correspondence I explore here and elsewhere throughout Relocations make themselves felt through broadcast networks across time. And yet structurally, remote intimacy in both of these provincial contexts makes it possible to describe how we experience our own spaces in correspondence with others. The spatial fantasies engendered by textual and audiovisual echoes that cleave a place like Birmingham to Riverside or San Bernardino would be something akin to, but not as diplomatically chic as, sister cities or town twinning. So unlike most urbanites who assume that the suburban is always oriented towards its closest city, I like to think that these imaginary correspondences with sister elsewheres sometimes have to happen across greater distances, both conceptually and topographically, with other ethnicities, accents, nations, and even other empires that feel more benevolent, though they surely are not, simply owing to the fact that they are not ours. The sense of belatedness that intensifies these correspondences brings both imperial and queer temporalities to perilous crossing, despite neatly apportioned suburban grids. And part of what I get into here that I'll kind of gloss over for you now is the ways in which kind of the temporalities of post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies that have talked about this presumed belatedness of the native, temporality of the native that is burdened by time, belated, atavistic, crosses over with the suburban imaginary that also, the suburban temporality that is also behind the times, that is also belated. Okay? And the way I get to that is I talk a little bit about Homi Bhabha's location of culture in relation to something like what Elizabeth Freeman has theorized as a concept called temporal drag. And for her, that temporal drag is a way in which actually queer female bodies, and lesbians in particular, are a real drag, kind of as a pun, but also temporally. That lesbians are always kind of inhabiting stylistically, sartorially, culturally, a space behind the kind of avant and forward-moving politics of queer. So I don't know if that makes much sense to everyone, but yeah, the lesbian kind of enacts this kind of stylistic and temporal drag onto queer. So, so I want to kind of, move from that little temporal temporal discussion there to think about the collisions that we've just been experiencing between the kind of historical drag, and then the kind of movement towards these avant-queer politics. And also part of what Freeman talks about is part of why lesbians exert drag on kind of queer politics and theory is that they're always attached to kind of the wrong objects, to improper objects, and to things like maybe a second wave feminism that is no longer politically hip, right? And so these kind of attachments to improper objects are part of what also distinguishes that concept of temporal drag. Okay. So what would we do then to, in the context of an inland empire, of muddled imperial imaginaries? How do we sort proper or improper objects of continuity or discontinuity? So what happens, in other words, when subjects of color, and queer subjects of color in particular, create a break with one set of prior signs from their so-called empires, regions, or nations of origin by relocating their fantasies to mainstreams, empires, and elsewheres that were never there? So it would be easy to think of these attachments to improper objects and imperial pasts within a reactionary logic, something to be expected in an environment like the Southern California suburbs that incubated various forms of grassroots conservatism during its own growth spurts in the 20th century. When it all boils down to it, maybe we were just being radical in the shallow 1980s half-shirt and bumper sticker sense of the word when we turned to British pop and its imperial new wave. Despite being dispersed subjects around the block, across the freeway, or in another subdivision, this was our collective contingent effort to become civilized persons of culture, because that's what British accents mean, right? When our own failed to qualify as civilization in others' eyes, we harnessed Britain's civilizing mission founded on culture itself to avert the shameful circumstances wrought by the empires of our familiar in these shadowless inland valleys. It was a form of class passing, but in a truly academic sense. Not passing as rich, since most of us resided squarely within that scrappy lower middle income bracket, but passing as smart. Finding ourselves through British New Wave and New Romantic pop of the 80s was to become, in Oscar Wilde's words, an echo of someone else's music, to be actors of a part that may not be written for us. And one cannot help but add another echo to layer over this at this moment, courtesy of Morrissey and the Smiths. Keats and Yeats are on your side, but you lose, because Weird Lover Wilde is on mine. And yet this chamber of echoes may inevitably yield something more reparative than the compulsion to confess stubborn attachments to improper objects and archives, a temporal drag rescripted in the catchy idioms of empire. Heard all at once, these echoes whisper into practice, an analytic we couldn't articulate then, but might be able to now. An analytic of burden that we still desperately want to resist, and from which we queerly dream of taking flight. But it is precisely the sense of burden, not the white man's burden, but the burden of the white man's empires, carried by queer, racialized subjects through time, that an analytic of empire and sexuality in the suburbs seems to demand. So, in its own twisted way, this practice resembles what Chela Sandoval has called a methodology of the oppressed, an undoing, in her words, of the apartheid of theoretical domains, and I would add cultural material objects that allow one imperial accent to unleash the babble of so many other imperial legacies in spaces like the suburbs that would stucco blast them into uniformity. And we hear them again in the earlier echoes of queer color scholarship, in the disidentifications carefully wrought by Jose Esteban Munoz, bringing us back to where we started with the echo of the subject, the autobiographical gesture, which, in La Coulabat's words, is also the theoretical gesture. And this is his kind of description of disidentification. I'll let you read it. Won't read it aloud to you as I finish my own concluding thoughts here. Connecting with the rapier wit of Weird Lover Wilde through Morrissey's flaccidly accented intonations may start as an attempt to come to terms with an imperial legacy that seems more glamorous, if purely for its spectacular remoteness from my own. But like the provincial girl who makes a cameo in Sedgwick's retrospective preface to Between Men, the incredulity stirred by those encounters creates the impetus, at the very least, to explore the incidentals, to ask why the British accent never dies in the Inland Empire, and wonder how this might mean something queer. It points to the interstices not only of empire, but literally to the margins of books and queer theoretical storytelling, like the anecdote Munoz tells about his suburban spectatorship of the swishy spectacle of Truman Capote on late-night TV. This incidental tale of shared broadcast consumption could very well seem disposable, another trinket of personal memory weighing us down as we flee towards something bigger, yearn for a more profound sense of history, time, and queer progress. Like the tiny navel of the orange that bears its name, this excess flesh may seem like a useless side effect in service of a manufactured end, the promise of something bigger, more succulent, more convenient by virtue of its mutant seedlessness. But these mutations hint at other questions and ephemeral histories that demand other answers. These answers lie not only with me and the circuitous paths I took through the outposts of the British Empire, as disparate as Duran Duran's Sri Lanka or Oscar Wilde's Reading Jail, the jail of reading. It resides in anyone listening, in anyone who ever listened and could never let go of the provincial fantasy that there was not only something more out there, but everything right here. That's it. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We have some time for some questions.
You'll see, I told you there were going to be two colliding parts of it. One was kind of you could follow along with a kind of historical narrative and through line, and what happens, and this is part of where condensing it from this large, sprawling, I always say that the book resembles Suburbia. It's sprawling, unruly. That part of what, kind of truncating these things together is to force at least them to try to make sense in that interstitial crossing over, right, on the Cloverleaf. Yeah?
Thank you. I have a question about why you separate out the immigrant experience of I was thinking of, as you were unraveling this and unpacking for us, I was thinking about how punk was taken up in the Inland Empire far differently than it was taken up in LA. And it was a very nationalistic, Anglophile, white supremacist sound that came out of the Inland Empire in particular. So I'm curious, because you said that it's kind of, it's almost like you're saying it was very unique an immigrant experience to kind of have this longing for that Anglo-Empire experience. So I was just wondering, explain that more.
Well, I wasn't making the case that only kids of color listen to British pop or those forms of British pop music. And in fact, the fact that I kind of narrowed in not on something like punk, which has its own kind of articulated political, cultural life and scene, and focused on something very mainstream like British New Wave, synth pop, etc., kind of the alternative music, is to also kind of resituate and rethink how we talk about the kind of immigrant experience as something that's often supposedly excluded from the mainstream, but that I actually think part of what I'm trying to articulate here is how its interaction with the mainstream is where we see these other things, these other theoretical possibilities fomenting. But in terms of, I would also say though that, I wouldn't say necessarily that, I think that it's much more complicated than to think that the punk scene of the Inland Empire and the punk ska scene in particular of that area was much more supremacist than any others. I think that what it presented, or what actually happened there, were these weird collisions, right, between people who identified with that scene and who were kids of color, right, who wanted to be a part of it. So that's just something that I would add. But yeah, I'm very much interested in instead of thinking more kind of subculturally, I wanted to think more about these kind of broader networks, right? Kind of broader mainstream networks. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
So I was really struck by the Cloverleaf as a kind of template for your talk, and it kept it kept reappearing for me throughout your different the different segments of the talk. So the empire, the British Empire, the history stuff, you can see it as this kind of Cloverleaf, these different discourses, these different histories entangled and coming into collision. And I was also struck by your description of yourself as a driver on the Cloverleaf, which I also experienced, where you have that kind of moment of total terror where you're going to die.
Sometimes you just want to close your eyes and go over,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, you just kind of close your eyes and you open them and think, okay, I didn't die again, so that's good. And I see that again in your description of British pop and the 80s, and those, I see another Cloverleaf there, you know, with those different discourses and those different histories and the accents. And I'm wondering about this, right? These two right now, you know, the kind of those images, and thinking about the Cloverleaf in 2009 and not 1985, and the way in which, since 1985 and 2009, so many things have become, you know, kind of marketed and commodified in different ways, including queers of color, and including immigrants, and including different sorts of sounds. And so I'm wondering, what's the next stop here? Or if you could just comment on this stop right now, you know, what the Cloverleaf looks like right now.
What the Cloverleaf looks like right now is people looking for work, looking for work as well as pleasure. Well, actually, like the final third of the chapter really focuses on a pretty contemporary novel set in the Inland Empire that has is a multi-voiced novel, and that includes certain queer or color characters in it. But the main thing that I kind of focus on in that novel is, and the part that's missing from this talk, is what in the last 20 years has happened to something like U.S. empire and militarism that changed this particular, you know, that is attached to this history, but changed this landscape, and that actually informs the spaces of sociability and the kind of circulations of these bodies through these clubs, these other spaces. I'll just comment quickly on these photographs. I know I just slapped them up here. It's like, there's more to this, and you know, if you want to ask me, there's more. You know, because a big chunk of the chapter is actually devoted to how the strip mall is at once a kind of an architecture of empire and convenience, but it's how it's become the kind of entrepreneurial space for immigrants throughout Southern California and the region. But it's also become kind of different from the other queer social spaces where, you know, you think of like going to these crazy hip queer clubs and bars. They're mostly located in strip malls throughout the inland region. You can just pull in next to the Big O tires and then go have a dance, right? And I went with photographer Deanna Erdman, who's an Inland Empire-based photographer. She's actually based here now in LA, but she came and photographed some of these spaces that I get to allude to but don't really get to talk about because I spent so much time kind of plumbing the cultural field of these strip mall venues and the kinds of sociability that happen there. But I mean, I think that, you know, one way to think about when you're saying the commodification of queers of color, the commodification of sexuality, right, is well, what happens when you kind of think about, like, think very literally about queer sociability happening in a space of commerce, and what happens, like this novel Stillwater Saints, when you think about spirituality being transacted through a space of commerce. Through something like, you know, a strip mall without a gun, right? So I think that that's part of what I, you know, try to do. Part of what I try to model here is kind of flipping something that you would think is ostensibly and necessarily evil because it's, you know, resides squarely in the sphere of the mainstream of the commercial, but where the repurposing, a certain kind of repurposing, is made possible in part, you know, through the immigrant experience, through the queer experience, right? Other questions, comments?
I have one more question.
Sure.
Can you talk about the kind of, struggle maybe, of approaching cultural geographies with queer theory, but not making it a gender, sex, sexuality? I ask this because I'm in the process of doing this myself. Not focusing on gender, sex, and sexuality, but trying to use the theory as another productive tool over another kind of set of identifications, and also the way of cultural geography.
So the struggle of doing that?
Have you, like, do you get much support in that direction?
We'll see. I mean, I think that remains to be seen. You know what? I just set out to write this book the way I wanted to write it. And it was probably, I don't know, that might be a huge mistake, but part of what I wanted to do was to, like I said, to try to really figure out, I know that I can't write just a cultural history of this region, right? Because there's a lot of other theoretical labor that has to happen. If the intervention is to happen in changing queer discourses about Southern California and the suburbs, I'm going to have to engage with that material and think of it not just as a kind of theory to mobilize certain gestures, but as the cultural material itself, right, also. So I think that part of it for me was to just, basically approach every textual field, right, with that kind of critical, eye, figuring out like how they're once both material and theoretical, and yeah, it was really hard to write a project like this because I think that there's a certain schizophrenia that comes with how much demography am I going to be using. There is some in this book. There's a little bit of, like the suburbs, it's like a big box shop. There's a little bit of everything. It's kind of like a giant Costco, right? It's like you get a little, Parmesan and black truffle, and then you can buy, a blow-up pool or something like that. I mean, that's sort of like that. I just began to think in those ways of like, how do you, and I just tried to kind of enact it. And that's why I said in the beginning that a lot of the work had to be accomplished really kind of rhetorically for me, in terms of how do you tell a certain kind of story, right? And everyone would always ask, well, is it a theoretically driven book? What's happening? I was like, well, I think I'm telling a story, but that story is happening in different idioms, right? And so, so that's what it. So there was a struggle. We'll see. I mean, I still have to see whether or not people actually like it. But in terms of what I've done with it, I'm pretty happy with it.
I guess what I was asking is like how you are going to position it in terms of, or how you've been asked to position this book.
I'm an assistant professor in an English and gender studies program, and I guess I'm going to have to do that work of positioning it. I read one novel in this book. What I'm going to position it as is that I'm positioning it as this is a major research project that I spent a lot of time doing. It's interdisciplinary. Hired to do work in a gender studies department, and this is what is possible in these areas and fields, rather than this is what's already been established. That's how I'm going to try to do it. Let's see. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. I really enjoyed
Michelle.
your talk. So I am really interested in sort of this overlay or interaction between different schools of theory and study and fields. So how has your understanding of queer culture and queer studies in Southern California changed now that you've taken sort of out of the urban environment and moved into the suburbs? What has changed about your understanding of queer culture, but also of those relocations?
Well, I mean, I think that for me, it was less about needing to change my own sense of what, queer sociability, queer life, queer cultural production was like beyond the urban, and figuring out a way instead to articulate it, to animate it, right? I think that for me, I always knew that there were different, the certain ways in which kind of cosmopolitan queer lifestyles have been rendered, and in terms of, an attachment to, I don't know, it's mostly gender too, right? It's mostly kind of gay male vision of what urbanity and cosmopolitan means, cosmopolitanism means, how it's practiced, how it's channeled through wit and fashion and design, and and I was curious. I was like, well, okay, what about these more sedentary forms, perhaps, or those that are forced to kind of move within a limited radius, or those that have to improvise in a space that doesn't provide everything just around the corner, at least doesn't provide anything more than like milk and orange juice and so like architectures of convenience, right? So part of me was just to think of how convenience has always been at the center of like a queer cosmopolitan discourse, and what if we take that literally again? What if we kind of took that literally and thought about, well, what do you do? Like, is it always a kind of form of abjection? Is it always, you know, just like, oh, it's so sad they have to go hang out and dance in a parking lot because they have nowhere else to go? Or they have to drive somewhere to look for something. What does it mean to have contact with people when you're driving beyond something like walking culture? So for me, it was, like I said, I had sensed that it was different. And for me, it was just to figure out how it was and how to articulate it as such. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So if I understand you correctly, it was more of your attempt to theorize what you understood that didn't fit into queer studies.
Yeah,
and how to articulate it.
Exactly, that people hadn't talked about. It's like, you know, that what precludes a kind of lively queer lifestyle is not being able to walk, or like any kind of lifestyle really, like desirable urban lifestyles, the inability to walk somewhere, right? The inability to have certain commodities available to you, right? Or scenes ready-made to enter into. And so, I mean, and you know, in part, like, you know, LA, of course, LA's geography, I mean, I conclude with LA in the book, you know, spending so much time in this region. You think, well, it's possible to do it, and I know that you can do it in these ways.
I think we're out of time,
Yeah.
but I will
Oops, sorry.
say that just to kind of, to connect these last two comments or questions together, it seems to me that, for me anyway, what's so wonderful about your work is you know, following up from your comment about how you're looking at queer culture, queer theory, and thinking about it in a slightly different way. And this gets to Deborah's question, I think, is that you are queering method in a particular kind of way, and you're using a method that, kind of a queer method that is in relationship and not necessarily a challenge, but also does kind of challenge queer scholarship and queer cultural studies as a way to kind of open up this, you know, the understanding of the story that you're trying to tell. So, in any case, it was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.